In the 35 years since A Nation at Risk was published, and many of you know that that was the 1983 doom and gloom report, which warned that the US risked falling helplessly behind the competition because of the sorry state of American schools, we've seen a tsunami of education reform efforts, most of them involving top-down carrot and stick incentives. These have included the standards movement, NCLB, race to the top, the proliferation of standardized tests and standardized testing regimes of all sorts, punitive teacher evaluations linked to those tests, privatization in the form of charter schools and school vouchers, which allow parents to, or families to use public monies for private and religious school tuition. But the results of all that activity have not produced much in the way of improvement. NAEP scores, but that is by conventional measures. NAEP scores, and NAEP of course is considered the nation's report card, have been flat for decades. Although African Americans and Latino kids have shown some improvement, the math and English scores for 17-year-olds overall is still about at the same level it was in 1973. So this is a great time, both in New York City, with a relatively new chancellor, and with many changes happening nationwide, to look at education reform. Is it dead or not? And what's next for K through 12 education and all of its stakeholders, including kids, teachers, and society at large? So let's start with Tuesday's election. We saw a record number of teachers running for office, as well as a number of candidates running in communities where, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, education had become a hot-button issue. So what does the outcome of these races tell us about how Americans feel about public education, and what their policy and spending priorities are? And I'm going to ask Jennifer, who's had her ear to the ground throughout the country for many of these races, and with parents and local communities to get the ball rolling.
Well, thank you, Andrea. First, full disclosure, I am recovering from a pretty serious Betsy DeVos obsession. I spent a lot of time sort of on the DeVos trail, and I don't know if people remember, back in the spring of 2017, which now seems like a million years ago, she and the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, visited a school together in northwestern Ohio, and I actually tagged along, and which is how it was that I had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of people in a county that went 74% for Trump. And they were, there was such excitement about Trump, and I heard people say that they were thrilled about his cabinet picks, except for one. They were very unhappy about Betsy DeVos, and this got me so interested. Like, it seemed to me that there was a gap there that needed to be explored. So in the interest of keeping things brief, I'm going to sort of whisk us through what I think are some of the themes that came out in the election on Tuesday. So there's been a lot of attention paid to the teachers who ran for office, and then a few of the ballot initiatives about spending. But I think that's actually framing the question too narrowly. So I want to start with you've heard about some of these states where Republicans, especially Republicans who'd been in office, had unified control since 2010, were really punished by voters for not just cutting education funding and disinvesting from public education, but really sort of systematic efforts to weaken the structures of public education across the board. And so you saw this in Michigan, you saw it in Maine, you saw it in Kansas. So these were some of the states where voters really, they moved in across party lines to support Democrats who promised to make big investments in public education. Then there's sort of a sub-theme of that. Dana Goldstein from The Times had an interesting piece about this, that once Republican politicians started to realize the sort of passion and power of this constituency, they had to reverse their own positions. And so you saw Scott Walker make an attempt to rebrand himself as the education governor. You saw Doug Ducey in Arizona successfully do the same thing. And even in Ohio, where Mike DeWine, hadn't referred to public education in anything but the most disparaging terms for the last 15 years, is suddenly having to talk about investing in public education and investing in teachers. So those are two pretty interesting themes. Another is what I think of as the incredible disappearing Obama-era education reformer. Where were they? It was very, very difficult to find any kind of high-profile candidate who was embracing what we think of as Obama-era education reform. And I would put into that category things like charter school expansion, things like accountability, weakening tenure, et cetera. So you had a couple of candidates who were very high-profile reformers 5 years ago. I'm thinking of Jared Polis, who ran for governor, who was just elected governor of Colorado, and Ned Lamont, who won in Connecticut. Neither of them had anything to say about education reform in their candidacies. They ran on pretty bread and butter investment in public education, pre-K, more vocational opportunities, et cetera. And then the final theme that I think is really interesting, the two races in the South, in Georgia and Florida, there were huge differences in the positions of the candidates on public education. Populism has really been sort of tarred by its connection with Trumpism, but I think you could look at what Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum were calling for in their respective states as a kind of black populism, massive investments into public education. And when this is the last little thing I'll say about that, when the NAACP came out with its call for a moratorium on charter school expansions, people looked at that through a very narrow political lens. Oh, they've been bought off by the unions. Or, they're now sort of like wild-eyed activists. But if you read really closely, what they were arguing was that they worried that charter schools and other forms of school privatization were a way for states to wash their hands of the responsibility to educate black and brown kids. And what you heard Gillum and Abrams saying so loudly as part of their effort to build a different coalition of voters is that we won't accept that. So those were a few of the themes that I thought were really interesting and that we should keep an eye on.
Great, thank you. Stan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, what I would say is focus in on the governor's races. That's the most important thing. And I would put less focus on the campaign and what people ran on, and more on the opportunity now to get newly elected governors and existing governors to play a much more positive and stronger role in terms of an education reform agenda. So there are potential for both Democrat and Republican governors to be able to embrace a broader strategy than just the things that are divisive, like charters and choice and vouchers and things like that, but to get more focused on the substantive key issues. And I think we should separate out from an election to actually governing, and now you have a huge opportunity. And if those newly elected governors hear only from one set of stakeholders, well, the likelihood of moving forward is not as great as if they could hear from the variety of stakeholders who have a real interest in turning our education systems around. So I think the opportunity starts now after the election to be able to frame that discussion so that the governors who have great responsibility for education can move in a positive direction.
Great. Judith, anything to add?
Well, I think one thing that's important to remember is that those of us who are focused on education reform are really interested in the education platform of various candidates, but a lot of voters don't vote single issue, right? So I think it's also really important to look at the places where an election is just about education. So in California, where you had the superintendent of instruction, one of the candidates was pro-charter expansion and got enormous amounts of funding from outside the state for charter expansion, and that race is still neck and neck, but it appears that the pro-charter candidate has likely won. And I also
And that
think,
was the most expensive superintendent's race, I think, ever.
well,
right?
yeah, and if
Yeah.
you tried to, as I did, continually look at your mobile apps to try to see what was happening, it's not considered very important in national news. They have a list of all the statewide elections in California, and I would have to go deep into the website to get to instructions. You know, they had an insurance commissioner above, superintendent of instruction. So it wasn't necessarily the most high profile race, but it's interesting that people like us who are thinking about when people do go to the ballot box and they're specifically thinking about school reform, what are they compelled by? And I don't think there's any way to spin that as a rejection of charter school expansion, right? So I think that Americans are very invested in their public schools. Almost everyone in America sends their children to a traditional public school in their neighborhood or district. And we, in general, don't like anything that's going to weaken or dismantle that. But there's still a lot of support for alternative visions of that. And then I forget how you say his name, but the person who was just elected governor in Colorado, he didn't run on accountability and charter school expansion, but he ran on universal pre-K, statewide universal pre-K, which, I would vote for a broader view of school reform. That's certainly a school reform. However, the voters in that state rejected a ballot amendment that would have funded programs like that. So to your point, how are they going to pay for it? Who knows? They have a lot of difficulty getting increased public funding in states like Colorado, where they've cut funding for schools, like so many states cut funding for schools.
Right. Shail?
I think coming closer to home, the New York State Senate shifted from Republican to Democratic control, which will have a huge impact on education policy here.
Yeah.
And a lot of work on the part of the unions in New York State went into the campaigns. They weren't alone in that effort, and it wasn't a single issue vote, but the state Senate has sort of been the main sort of remaining advocate in government in New York State for sort of what's historically been termed the ed reform agenda. So I think there are going to be big shifts around teacher evaluations, around charter schools, and hopefully around school funding as well.
Great. So speaking locally, how do you change an education system as big as New York City's in a lasting way? And on the surface, it would seem that many of the key levers of the Bloomberg administration, including principal autonomy, the network structure, et cetera, were swept away. So how do you change a big system? Let me start with Judith and then go to Shail and Stan.
Okay, well, I'm going to differ a little bit with the premise of the question, because I think that, with all due respect to Shail over here, a lot of the things that the Bloomberg administration did that people really focused on did not affect students, teachers, and families. And so the network structure, I think most teachers in the New York City school system could not tell you what that was, even when they were in it. And so the fact that it's not there anymore, I don't think most people would notice. But I think there's a lot of things that the Bloomberg-Klein administration did that we do still have. And it might be in a slightly different form, but we have massively expanded school choice. That does not appear to be going away. We have a form of school evaluation. We don't have the letter grades anymore, but we still have, you go online and you can look up how a school's doing. They don't use a letter grade, but it's still a transparent form of evaluation. There's still an effort to get parents and students to evaluate, to fill out these surveys. They've adjusted the questions a little bit, but that notion of sort of treating families and students as consumers and giving them more information about their schools is still around. And the notion that if schools are not doing well, we should close them is still around. And Bloomberg said that he would, de Blasio, ran saying that he was not going to close schools, but he's operating against what's become a norm, that if schools are considered not doing well, we close them. And so, in fact, he's extended the life of some and then closed them. And he may have reduced the vision of closing them and put more money into them, but that's still sort of the norm. So I think, we had a mayor for 3 terms, and I think he did shift some of the norms. As a historian, taking the long view, the answer to the question, is school reform dead? No, it's not dead. It will never be dead. Americans have never said, we've got the best schools ever, let's sit back and enjoy, right? Americans have never said, we have the best teachers in the nation, let's sit back and enjoy. Although, towns and families have been often very proud of their local schools, and that continues, right? And we constantly see that in surveys that people rate, just like their Congress people, right? We rate our local schools well, the schools our kids go to well, but we say that the nation's in a shambles. David Tyek and Larry Cuban wrote a really nice book called Tinkering Toward Utopia in the early 1990s, where they address this larger question of what does it take. They really are addressing two questions. Why are we always thinking of our schools in crisis? And then why does it seem like no matter how hard we try, we can't change them? And their thesis was, we are changing them, but its bureaucracies are big and clunky, and that's partly to our benefit because it protects us from sort of the whims of the time. And also, they gave a set of precepts in terms of what's going to stick, right? And I think it's useful to answering your question. They said reforms that are likely to stick are first and foremost, they don't challenge the core purposes of schooling, right? So at the same time, you can make changes in the classroom, but not sudden reforms that will change sort of how we view schooling. They need strong constituencies. I don't think that at the time they anticipated the kind of money that was going into school politics and school reform when they thought of constituencies, but certainly we've seen how money has created strong constituencies in school reform, which is how we got something like Common Core. And Common Core is still here. Almost every state has something that's almost exactly Common Core, whether they call it that or something else. Like in New York State, we changed it, but it's basically Common Core. They said that it helps if you pass laws, again, so everything that the state legislatures did, including our own, has stuck around. And they said it has to, I can't remember, but I brought them here because I don't want to misrepresent. They said, they have to be supported by teachers and administrators. And that's interesting. We think about the teacher evaluation program. So while we still have testing and we still have Common Core, we're really moving away across many, many states in the value-added models, including here in New York City, partly because they can't win in court because they're not scientifically sound, but they also are not popular with teachers and administrators who have communicated that to families. And then finally, they need to be popular with lay people, right? Average Americans need to say, this makes sense to us. And so when you have a reform like choice, which we can analyze the pros and cons of it, and frankly, I see a lot more cons than pros, I don't think it's going anywhere because people like having choice. And I think it's going to be very difficult to roll that back.
Phil?
So when I started as a teacher, I was not fully licensed yet. I was before you had to be licensed. This was back in the early 90s. So on my first day, I got sent to HR to get a provisional license. And I ended up spending 3 days there. And on the third day, I had figured out that if I made friends with some of the folks at the sort of gatekeeper stage of the office, I might actually get something done. And so I started buying lunch for one of the folks working there, and eventually did get my provisional license by bringing a roast beef sandwich. And I share that story because this is one of the sort of more invisible aspects of the New York City school system that changed dramatically under Bloomberg. It was an incredibly dysfunctional place on the operational side. At the beginning of the school year, there were constantly stories on the front page of the newspaper about kids not knowing which school to go to, school not being able to open in certain places, materials not being there. And a lot of that had to do with a bureaucracy that had been completely unaccountable to educators or parents for decades. And the results of that was, on a pretty consistent basis, half of the kids in the city were failing. And it was almost like you had designed a system where, like clockwork, you would get the result of only 50% of the kids graduating. And part of what changed during that period, there were the sort of big hot button issues like charters and accountability, but part of what changed was a deep effort to try and rethink government and think about how do you make government actually work and work in ways that are responsive to the needs of schools and communities. And by no means did we master that during that period of time. But there were some real improvements, and I think the most lasting of those was the decision to think about secondary schools differently. We had a lot of schools that had sort of become accepted in the system as schools that were going to consistently fail children. And so the place where I started working as a principal, Morris High School in the South Bronx, was taking in 700 ninth graders a year and graduating a little bit less than 80 4 years later. And we went through a process that was sort of a pilot in 2001, just before Mayor Bloomberg came into office, funded by Gates and Carnegie and Soros. And we reshaped that building into 4 small schools. And over a period of 4 years, the graduation rate shifted to roughly 75% of kids graduating. And as that old school phased out and got smaller and started to benefit from some of the instructional work that was happening in the other schools in the building, their last class, 220 kids graduated, which was triple what they had been seeing for about 10 years. And so what we saw there at Morris, and I think then repeated in dozens of places around the city, was that if you think differently about the way adults work together in school, you can get really different outcomes for kids. And what I mean by that is creating a context where teachers and school leaders can come together and envision school in terms of what do the kids in this building, in this community need? And how do we create an instructional context and a set of practices around the classroom that actually are focused on students' needs and help them navigate the challenges, in this case, of high school. And there's a lot of education research in this country that, you know, when you do a randomized controlled trial study and you get like 0.1 or 0.15 improvement, that's seen as a big hit. That's a real success. The research on the small schools in New York City during this period, which was done by MDRC, and because of how enrollment worked, they could actually simulate a kind of randomized situation because some kids applied to the same school and got in and others didn't. The change in graduation rates for the same kids who applied to the same school and those that got in and those didn't get in were about 10% different. So that kind of impact is unheard of in education reform or in any kind of intervention. We saw the graduation rate during that period go from roughly 48 to almost 70%, and it's continued to rise in the last few years. And we saw the dropout rate cut in half. And a lot of that had to do with creating 800 new schools across the city and creating school contexts that were more humane, both for the adults and for the children. And I would say the lasting impact of the Bloomberg administration's work is not the structural changes. It's not the sort of big work that was front page on the newspapers. It's the fact that in creating those 800 schools, you also created new instructional communities for educators where teachers were coming up in contexts where there was real voice and real opportunity to shape practice and opportunity to develop leadership. And those teachers now, 10 years later, have become principals, have become superintendents, have become central office leaders across the system. And I would say that sort of generational shift of folks having the experience of working in a different kind of school environment that was less bureaucratic and more democratic has really changed the system in deep ways and is continuing to change it in ways that we can't fully predict.
Thank you. So small schools, though, predated the Bloomberg administration, right, Stan? So was that one of the lasting changes? Now, are there others?
Well, I think that there are a lot of changes that will be lasting. And I think it's important when you think about sustaining change, when administrations change, is, you know, what are the characteristics of the reform and how can it be implemented in a way that it sustains itself? So government, not just school leadership, but mayors, governors, presidents, they transition. And looking at what reforms survive is not only how good it is, but how it was structured and where was the support network that allows it to continue. So sometimes if things are branded so closely with a particular individual, it's the initiative of Joe Jones, or it's the initiative of Sarah Smith, then somebody new comes in and they want to change it because they want everything to be branded their own. But if there is a reform that can have a constituency that pushes for it during that transitional period and into the next phase, and that constituency is broad enough and strong enough, then the likelihood of a reform continuing when there's a shift at the top increases. So take the example of small schools. So there were small schools in New York City and innovative programs back in the 1980s, but it was not a system-wide initiative. In the early 1990s, when I was deputy chancellor working for Chancellor Fernandez, he tried to bring that to scale, starting off with 30 small schools, and got on board the teachers union because there was some issue that would they be in favor of changing the school structure and making it a new school or a small school. What would it do in terms of the ability to hire teachers or to promote teachers, and how would that be done? And the constituency for innovative small schools became sort of broad, and it started then. And then it transitioned over a variety of different leadership in the city. But I think one of the reasons why it didn't go by the wayside was because the constituency was broader than just a chancellor or the school system. It included a variety of constituencies outside. Some of them were from the philanthropic community, some of them were from the business community, some of them were from not-for-profit organizations and advocacy organizations, and they helped this thing to continue. And then when Joel Klein came in as chancellor and Mayor Bloomberg was mayor, that expanded greatly. And there were a lot of good things that happened as a result of that, but there was a broader constituency for it. I think it got mixed into the notion of, is it good or bad to close schools? And I think the answer to that is, if the school is not working, of course it's smart to close the school. And why would you ever want to take a policy that says, I'm never going to close a school, we're not closing any schools? Yes, you should try a variety of different methods to improve the school in a variety of different ways. But if none of those methods work, then of course you should consider closing the school. Of course you should look at other innovative approaches. And the research that Shael cited in terms of MDRC demonstrates that it worked over a longer period of time. But I think what's important is, what is the lesson about a reform? Is the lesson that if it's totally branded for one individual and somebody new comes in, and it was unpopular in some ways, does that mean that it is going to be changed and it is going to be discarded? Or could it mean that it is sustained or perhaps improved or changed? And I think as we look at these initiatives that have become so divisive for some people, whether it's choice is not a bad thing. It's only bad when you implement it improperly. Teacher evaluation is not a bad thing. It's only bad when you implement it wrong. Having high standards is not a bad thing. It's only bad when you implement it wrong. So if you think about these core elements of reform, the things that are most important, improving the quality of teaching, professional development for teachers, very important. School leadership, the operational structure of a school system, and figuring out how it connects to higher education and social services and all those things. These are core elements that are important and significant. How you do it is what's important. And whether you do it in the right way and build the constituency that's going to sustain it through the change in leadership is critically important. So when you think in a school system about a new reform, and we've got newly elected officials who will come up with reforms, think about how you structure it, think about the constituency that is likely to sustain it, think about the way in which you're going to build a bigger tent so that people can be for it, and an evaluation system that allow it to change, and figure out how it goes from one initiative into something that is sustainable and scalable. Having one good school is not enough. Figuring out what are the core elements of it that bring it along, and build into that scale-up strategy the way in which you eliminate the barriers, because there'll always be barriers to scaling that reform. So think about it in that kind of way. I think some of the things that were done in the Bloomberg administration are good, and they need to be sustained. Some of the things that were done going back to the Fernandez days when I worked there were good and needed to be sustained. And the things that aren't good do need to be discarded.
Great. Jennifer, outside of New York, can you think of any changes that really stick in your mind as being lasting and positive?
Well, I want to take this question and combine it with something that Stan said earlier, because I think there is this, I see sort of prominent education reform advocates talking about the governors and, that somehow that things are going to sort of go back to the way they were pre-Trump. And my vision is much bleaker. I think that we have to acknowledge what it means for school policy that we're in this hyper-polarized era, and that if you look at it in terms of education history, the bipartisan coalition that's really driven so much of education reform since the 80s, a huge part of that has been sort of business-minded Republicans. And that's, where are they in the Trump coalitions? Why I worry about that. When I look at a state like Florida, where as a result of that governor's election, Florida had already been on this sort of school choice on steroids path, and they are likely, they're focused on things like amending their state constitution to, sort of scrub out the part where the state is responsible for providing a universal education, and unbundling schools like you would unbundle viewing options from your cable company. So when I look at a state like Florida, and I think, how can the business people look at their private school choice program? It's almost $1 billion. What kind of future do they see that they really think that kids are going to do well in schools where not just teachers are unlicensed, but you don't even have to have a bachelor's degree to teach at one of these private religious schools? And so I think that, I personally think, at least in the short term, the sort of theory of change where the moderates from both parties come together and think about education reform in terms of human capital and workforce preparation, I think that the combination of hyper-polarization and then also this problem where the Republicans are more and more the party of voters without bachelor's degrees at a time when some 70% of Republicans think that higher education is basically indoctrination camps. Like, so much of education reform has been about college preparation, but we're going to have a serious problem when you have on one side of the aisle, you're going to have major pushes to disinvest from public higher ed. And so I know that's not really answering your question. It's more taking
That's a good point,
I know, it's important to focus on New York City, but I have a bubble problem in Massachusetts too. And when I look state by state and see what the debates in these states actually sound like, I think we have to be aware of what's going on and where we're possibly headed. So sorry to bring everybody down.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I mean, I think just to talk about the small school reforms, which, for people unaware of what small school reform looked like in New York City and around the country with Bill and Melinda Gates money, it wasn't just making big schools smaller, it was creating schools of choice. And here in New York City, but not exclusively in New York City, school choice models around the country, whether they're charter schools or here in New York City, not charter schools for the most part, schools in New York City get to choose students, not just students get to choose schools. So our current chancellor came in and looked at our system and said, we have created a two-tier system of winners and losers, and our schools are actually perpetuating second-class status for huge swaths of children who are almost exclusively black and brown, which is not to suggest that there are not black and brown children being very successful in New York City schools, but there is a gross cost to this model. And if we only look at the success stories, we forget about who's been weeded out through this system of selectivity, right? And we know, the research on school choice is overwhelming in that aspect, that there are winners and losers. We might, as a society, decide that we're okay with that, right? And maybe that's what's going to happen in Florida. We'll see. Florida has been disinvesting in public schools for a very long time, and so many of Florida voters don't have children in the public schools, right? Which is why we see that happening in a lot of retirement states. We see something similar happening. But it's really important that we do think globally and beyond sort of the experience of the kids who get into these schools, right? And we have many, many, many more exclusive schools in New York City now than we did before. And this kind of system is being replicated around the state. So in that sense, we're different in New York because we're a city, but we're a massive city, 1.1 million public school children. And even though we have a larger private school sector than most of the rest of the country, still almost everyone goes to public school. And so we need to really think about how that affects everybody. And the obviousness of closing schools is not obvious to a lot of those communities. And that's why when there were state mandated hearings about closing schools, the local families would come out and oppose it, and our chancellor at the time famously would put earplugs in so he did not have to listen to what they had to say. He was mandated to sit there. He was not mandated to listen. And it's unfortunate, the construction of this panel, that we don't have anyone representing those constituencies here. But to say, well, this is an obvious thing that should happen, it's not obvious to a lot of the families involved. And I think that when we discount the families involved, then we get a new kind of bipartisan coalition. So who was fighting against Common Core and Common Core testing? The far left and the far right? The representations of populism that felt left out of those business-friendly moderates. And we have to take them seriously. And I think one of the many lessons we learned from the 2016 election, and frankly from the election this week, is that we cannot in the middle say, oh, these are extremists and we can ignore them, because actually they can form their own coalitions and they can vote out people who are perceived as elitist in the middle, spouting common sense. It doesn't seem common sense to the lived experiences of especially poor families, whether they are poor families who support Trump or they are poor families who run away from Trump. They don't appreciate being talked down to.
Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I agree with some of that, and I disagree with some of it as well. But when we look at sort of like the idea of innovation in the schools, there is an innovation in the schools, and I've been very involved in it, and Shale was too. It's called P-TECH. And the idea was that, yes, we want every kid to go to college, but when we look at our kids college ready, such a huge percentage of them are not college ready. And such a huge percentage of low-income youth are not college ready, and children of color are not college ready, so their college completion rates are disastrously low. So in innovation, a grade 9 to 14 school began in New York City when Joel Klein was the chancellor, as a collaboration between the City University of New York, a business where I worked at the time, IBM, the New York City Public Schools, with strong support from the teachers union, strong support from the principals union, strong support from community organizations. And now, 8 years later, it has college completion rates 500% higher than the national average and has spread to over 100 schools now across 8 states. It is an innovative model, but it is an open enrollment school. There's no barrier for kids to get in. So if you look at the population in the schools, they are overwhelmingly low income and overwhelmingly children of color. But it was an innovation, and it actually started in a school that was closed. Now, it didn't have to start in a school that was closed. The school could have stayed open, and it could have been a school within a school model. It could have been done in a different way. That was not what was critically important. But what was critically important is that it needed a reform. It needed to sustain itself across a variety of different chancellors. It needed to expand so that it wasn't just one model. So in the fall of 2019, there'll be over 200 P-TECH schools. And not just one company involved making a commitment to mentor every student, to provide paid internships for the students, and actually make a guarantee that successful students are first in line for actual jobs, and supported to continue their bachelor's degrees or their master's degrees in an open enrollment school that was an innovation. So I think we need to look beyond the divisiveness of, is the idea of innovation bad or wrong? Is the idea of starting something innovative or creative or new bad or wrong? But the way in which it's done is critically important in terms of sustaining it. So is it important that the teachers' union is a strong supporter of this? Yes, it is important, because had they not been, it might have built in a barrier. Is it important that civil rights organizations are standing up around the United States in support of it? Yes, it's important. And is it important that you have employers involved? Yes, because you want them to make the commitments to provide the mentoring and the paid internships and the actual, opportunities so that students could actually have jobs, and do it in a way that is, scalable.
Stan, when I first heard about P-TECH way back when, my first question was, I wonder why they're doing this as a public school and not as a charter school. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I suspect that the comment you made about the teachers' union probably has something to do with it.
Absolutely. First of all, none of the P-TECH schools are charter schools, and why is that important is because the idea was to build the reform so that it would be scalable. And if it were a narrow constituency, it would have appealed to some, but it wouldn't have gotten from one school to 100 schools in 6 years and to 200 schools in 8 years. And oh, by the way, look at all the countries around the world that are starting P-TECH. Singapore, Korea, Australia, Morocco, looking at a model that was created in New York and implementing it globally. So build into the design something that isn't going to make it restrictive and have barriers. I think the open enrollment program was critically important, because if it had been a selective enrollment, or if it had been a lot of money to spend on that school, it would have said, okay, well, it works because you spent more money. Okay, it works because you cherry pick the students. Okay, it works because you're not doing it within the existing rule and regulation of how schools operate. So when you build a reform, and if you're looking for it to be scalable and sustainable, in the design of it, don't make it restrictive. So I think the idea of not saying it's only about charter schools, or it's only about schools where have an admissions criteria, or if it's only going to be spending 40% more, when you look at the reforms that have done that, some work, some don't, but the idea of making them to scale is there are barriers built into making it scalable.
Thank you. So, we've talked a lot this morning about different constituencies, stakeholders, so forth. What we haven't really touched on very much is the role of the ultra-wealthy and the private sector in education reform. So I wonder, what should the role of the private sector be in education, if any? And does it make a difference if it's a company like IBM or a foundation like the Gates Foundation? Shale, do you want to lead us off?
Look, I think that one of the problems with the sort of big foundations that have supported education reform is that they are pushing for educational equity in an economy where they benefit from inequity. And so there's a kind of rhetoric reality gap in terms of the actions of our benevolent billionaires, in the sense that, part of the problems that we're trying to solve with education are created by the structure of American capitalism and how we're organized. And it becomes sort of tricky, I think, for those same folks to authentically then become the primary advocates for equity. And not that they can't do good, but the grounding from where they're working is by definition in some ways at odds with the communities that they say they're hoping to serve. And so that is the dilemma. And then from the perspective of an educator who, as I shared earlier, like my school, which I believe did really powerful things in terms of equity for children, wouldn't have come into being without those funders. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are real meaningful ways that educators can use those resources to shape practice. And that's a dilemma. If it ends up being that you get controlled in that equation, it's a bad outcome. But I don't think it's automatically a bad outcome. I think there are ways to have really powerful impacts. And I also think that there are ways to influence and shape the direction of the policy that those foundations are sort of propagating. And I think that's part of our job as educators and as leaders to do that.
I suspect that Jennifer may have a different viewpoint.
Well, I worry about what I would describe as the slippery slope problem. And, it's really interesting when you go back and look at the right's push for school privatization, and that William Bennett first proposed education savings account when he was working for Ronald Reagan. And this has remained the right's dream all these years, that the parent would have access to the funds and then make the choice about where and how the child should be educated. And now they've moved towards a model of what I call edu debit cards, and this is what was on the ballot in Arizona. And so you would not just use the money, it's not just school choice, but school broken down into its component parts, so that you might pay for an online course, you might buy a homeschooling curriculum, you might pay for some tutoring, but it's divorced from it's all provided by private companies, and it's divorced from a structure of the school and the democratic institutions. So this to me seems like a crazy vision, right? But when you look at the history, you see that over time, people who are not on the right start to talk more and more like people who were driving that original vision. So now it's routine that we hear people say the money should follow the child. And so if you're a Betsy DeVos, it's really easy for you to then ask, well, why should the money only be able to follow the child to this kind of school? Yeah. So that's why I worry. I think we have a slippery slope problem where you have a lot of states now where you can only have, your charter schools can only be governed by nonprofits. But what is then the argument against sending state money to high-performing parochial schools? So that's my issue.
Right. Stan?
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between private philanthropy and private sector engagement and involvement in the quality of public education. So it's the difference between spare change or real change. The spare change approach is if somebody makes a lot of money, and then they have the right to give that money away, and in a philanthropic way, pick education, and there's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it. Look at the example of Mark Zuckerberg. He has $100 million. He gives it to the Newark public schools in the wrong way. It results in no positive change whatsoever. And it wasn't just the bad thing was the dollars. It was the way in which it was thought about, the way in which it was structured. If you want to provide your financial resources to do something positive, you need to do it in the right way. And you need to think about it in the right way. Shayle's point about doing it in a collaborative way, engaging people in the decision-making, not just I went to school and I know everything about education, so I have $100 million or $500 million and I'm just giving it away, and it could be done that produces no positive change, or it could be done in a way that actually produces negative change in much in the way that we're talking about. So I think we're going to see a lot more opportunity for philanthropic dollars to be contributed, but that spare change needs to be contributed in a way that engages and involves educators in the right kinds of solutions. But that's not the private sector. The private sector isn't just check writing. The private sector opportunity in terms of engaging in public education could be done in a more meaningful and structural way. And that is engaging people to be involved in the schools in a way that is significantly important. We've had something in the United States, we called it vocational education, right? And we wanted the private sector to be engaged and involved because we wanted some students to be able to, have jobs. Now, the economy has changed. So those jobs need to include higher quality education. So vocational education had to be changed. Not just create a new brand and call it career and technical education, but actually structure it in a way that the employer is involved in a way that doesn't just provide opportunity for some students, but provides opportunity for all students. And we want the private sector to be engaged in that. That's not about check writing. That's not about philanthropy. It's about a shared interest in improving the quality of learning. And it also includes the private sector to be engaged and involved in an advocacy standpoint. Because spending money on our public schools isn't just in the best interest of parents or students, it's in the interest of the private sector. So I think we need to set the bar higher. I think we need to help people understand what to be able to do with the private sector resources, whether it's just check writing or whether it's more substantive. You know, we have an opportunity now. There are a whole lot of people who are working in the private sector who are not interested in retirement. They're interested in second careers. Could they have second careers as teachers? You know, there are going to be something like, 800,000 people with science and technology degrees who are looking for a second career. What about the opportunity to capture those people in the public schools? That's not about check writing. So I think how we engage the private sector is critically important, and do it in a way that benefits the schools. Not, I have my idea and I'm going to do it in a disruptive way or something that produces no positive effect, but do it in a way where those resources are captured in a way that provide real opportunity and real benefit, that do something significant and important, like improve the quality of teaching.
Great, thank you. Judith?
I mean, I'm old school. I believe in public governance. I believe in democracy. I think that the private sector's job is to pay taxes that support public government, and then the voters get to decide. When we have public schooling, not here in New York City, which has mayoral control, but in most of the country, public schooling means we as voters get to make decisions about school governance.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons why things like mayoral control and sort of privatized controlled schools through nonprofit boards or for-profit boards became popular in many communities is because we weren't always doing a great job protecting that democratic process. So, I mean, if someone had a lot of money and they asked me what they should do with it in terms of giving to schools, I would say I think you should invest in protecting voting rights. And I think you should invest in strengthening community boards and school boards so that all the people get to be involved in making decisions about what public schooling looks like, instead of letting different reformers with different ideas battle it out in the private marketplace over who's got more money. I mean, I think that people with all that kind of money should be giving it to the government. Or if they really don't trust the government, just give it to poor people. Just give them the money. Because we know the best predictor of school success is financial stability. So give the families financial stability.
Well,
then our test scores will really go up.
We had a philanthropist, his name was Andrew Carnegie, and he created the public library system in the United States of America. That was philanthropy, and it was done in a way that was collaborative, and it produced lasting effect. And if we said, no, Andrew, don't do that, we don't want public libraries, I think that would have been a huge mistake.
Yeah. So on that note, I want to shift gears. We only have about 5 more minutes, so let's try to be super concise. The teachers' unions have been under assault all over the country. What is the future of unions, and what should it be? And Jennifer, why don't you lead us off?
Well, I think you're, in this fascinating moment where it's undeniable that there has been this assault. Many fewer teachers have left than I think the right was expecting. And then you have this sort of broader context where the attitudes of people towards unions are really changing too. So you have Google workers walking out over the way their company handled sexual harassment claims and identifying with the Marriott strikers. To me, that's amazing. That's really positive. But I think one of the consequences of this hyperpolarized environment is that the unions become so focused on protecting themselves that they're not thinking about innovation, right? So I was at the AFT convention in Pittsburgh this summer, and it was like a 3-day political convention. There's not a lot of talk about teaching and learning, and I think that's I really believe in unions. I've seen them be a very powerful force for change, and that because teachers are usually the largest organized force in a community, when they get behind a broader vision, they can really lift a community up. But when they feel embattled and under siege, you don't see them playing that role, and I think that that's really a shame.
Shale?
Yeah, I think one of the ironic impacts of the Janus decision, which will reduce the budgets of teachers' unions, and it's something that a lot of folks in the sort of center-right part of the ed reform movement were looking forward to, given their antagonism with the unions, is that we're going to see further erosion of public funding for both regular district schools and public charter schools. Because the unions historically have been the primary weight within state capitals that have sort of stood in the way of reductions in school funding and have pushed to increase school funding. And so I think that there's an interesting shared interest that wasn't really fully visible until now, that has, there's some real risk to both the charter movement and to regular public schools as a result of that decision. And I think that it begs the question of what kinds of alliances may need to form between ed reformers and unions in order to maintain public funding.
Judith?
I mean, I don't know what role unions should play. I was a teacher in a right-to-work state where the union at the time was highly racist, so I did not join it. But we saw all those walkouts, last year were in right-to-work states, and I'm not an expert in union organizing, but a lot of the analysts said, in some ways, the reason why this happened was because there was no union infrastructure to sort of lead the way, and so it could happen really through grassroots on the ground. When I was in California, a lot of the reform-minded teachers joined alternatives to the union because they felt that the union was preventing them, and yet we know that the union has played a really important, institutional governance role in getting people out to vote and protecting public schools. So, the union here in New York City is very powerful, even still, and sometimes it uses its power for good, and sometimes it doesn't. It may be that, to be slightly heretic here, it may be that a reduction in union power potentially could energize some other possibilities for reform and activism. I don't know. This is one that I don't know what's going to happen. I don't feel so passionate about this one.
Stan?
Well, when I was Deputy Chancellor of Schools in New York City, I dealt with 30 different bargaining units. You were always in labor negotiations with labor, and you needed them on your side, desperately needed them on your side. And if you had a negotiation, it was better to come up with a solution that you could find that would gain their support, because in the implementation of it, you needed them day to day. And I think that the changes that we're talking about here are things that hopefully some unions will recognize and behave in a progressive way. I'm a member of the Albert Shanker Institute at the AFT. I'll identify that. And I think that there's a lot of interest, not just in unions supporting financing of our schools, but thinking about teacher professional development in a different way. And they have been supportive of a variety of different innovations. And I think the challenge is to figure out how to bring them into the process. The same is true about principal unions. They're a potentially significant and important player. And the individual bargaining units that control other individuals who work in our schools. So I think it would be a mistake to think about building reform without engaging your employees. Some people always say, I've worked in all sectors. I worked in the not-for-profit sector, I worked in government, I worked in business. People always think that in business you just make the rules and the workers do whatever you want. That's not really the case. You've got to get them engaged and involved in whatever innovation and reform you're looking at. So if they happen to be represented by a union, probably a mistake to not want to engage them in a positive way, because you won't have their strength and their weight to implement what you want to do.
Wow, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much to my panelists and to all of you for coming. Thank you.